The marina had seen wealth before. Old money, loud money, quiet money. But nothing like this. People stopped mid-step as the water began to shift unnaturally, rippling outward like the ocean itself was holding its breath. Conversations died. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Every head turned toward the horizon where a black mega yacht emerged, long, silent, commanding. It didn't announce itself. It didn't need to. At the center of the dock stood Evelyn Harrington, heir to one of the most powerful shipping fortunes in the country. She was dressed perfectly, surrounded by people who smiled too much and meant too little. Yet something inside her tightened as the yacht drew closer. A strange, sinking familiarity clawed at her chest. Then the gangway lowered. A man stepped forward. Tall, black. No designer suit, no security detail, just quiet authority in the way he stood, like someone who had survived storms others never even saw coming. Evelyn's breath vanished. She knew that face. 6 months ago, this same man had been forced out of the city in silence, holding 3 crying babies while being told it was for the best. 6 months ago, he was a broke black single father, scraping by at the docks, fixing engines no one else wanted to touch. 6 months ago, he disappeared overnight, without a goodbye, without an explanation. Because her mother paid $100,000 to make sure he did. Now he was back. Behind him, 3 identical toddlers appeared on deck, laughing, pointing at the water, dressed like they belonged to the sea itself. Triplets, healthy, fearless, unbroken. Whispers spread like fire. Who is that? That yacht costs more than the Harrington estate. Wait, isn't that the guy who vanished? Evelyn slowly turned. Her mother, Margaret Harrington, stood frozen, her polished smile cracked, her knuckles white around her glass. For the first time in decades, the woman who controlled rooms with a glance looked afraid. Her lips moved before she could stop herself. That's impossible. The man met her gaze from across the dock, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something far more dangerous. Peace. And in that moment, Evelyn understood something chilling. What they didn't know would change everything. Before the money, before the yacht, before the silence, Marcus Reed lived by the rhythm of the docks. Every morning before sunrise, he carried 3 small bodies from a narrow apartment above a bait shop, balancing diaper bags on one shoulder and a toolbox on the other. The harbor air was always cold at that hour, salt-heavy and unforgiving, but Marcus welcomed it. It kept him awake. It reminded him he was still standing. The triplets Malik, Micah, and Miles were barely 2 years old. They had his eyes, their mother's smile, and a laugh so loud it embarrassed strangers and softened men who swore they had no heart left. Marcus learned early that grief didn't disappear. It learned how to sit quietly while life kept moving. His wife, Naomi, had died bringing them into the world. One moment he was holding her hand. The next he was holding 3 infants and a promise he never spoke out loud but carried every day. I won't let the world break you. Money was always short. Time was always shorter, but Marcus never asked for pity. He fixed engines other mechanics turned away from, rusted hulls, drowned motors, boats everyone else had written off. There was something meditative about it. Broken things made sense to him. They just needed patience and honesty. People at the docks respected him, but respect didn't come with protection. He was useful, replaceable, invisible when convenient. Across town, the world looked very different. Evelyn Harrington grew up surrounded by glass walls and quiet expectations. Her life had been planned before she could walk. Elite schools, board seats, a future wrapped in legacy and obedience. Her father's shipping empire had made the Harrington name untouchable. After his death, her mother, Margaret Harrington, took control with surgical precision. Margaret believed in order, in bloodlines, in knowing exactly where everyone belonged. Evelyn didn't. She found herself drawn to the docks during moments she couldn't explain. Maybe it was the honesty of the place. Maybe it was the way work showed on people's hands instead of hiding behind polished smiles. That's where she noticed Marcus for the first time, kneeling beside a fishing boat, grease on his forearms, a baby carrier strapped awkwardly to his chest. 3 toddlers sat nearby, playing with ropes, supervised by an old deckhand who winked when Evelyn stared too long. Marcus didn't notice her at first. When he did, he didn't change. No flattery, no curiosity about her last name, just a polite nod and back to work. It unsettled her more than attention ever could. Over time, small moments stacked up. Marcus teaching his sons to wave at passing boats, singing to them softly while tightening bolts, talking to them like they were already men who deserved respect. Evelyn realized she'd never seen fatherhood like that, quiet, steady, unperformed. Margaret noticed Evelyn's absences. She followed once. From the safety of her car, she watched her daughter laugh at something Marcus said. Watched the children climb onto him like he was gravity itself. Watched a black man with no wealth and no invitation exist comfortably in a world she believed should never belong to him. Margaret didn't feel jealousy. She felt threat. She ordered a background check, learned Marcus had once been a marine engineer in the Navy, brilliant, decorated, left abruptly after his wife's death. No scandals, no crimes, just potential that had chosen survival over status. To Margaret, that made him dangerous. Because men like Marcus didn't beg, they endured, and endurance, she believed, could infect. Evelyn sensed the shift before it happened. The cold questions, the sudden interest in dock finances, the way her mother's voice sharpened whenever Marcus's name surfaced. Something invisible was tightening around all of them. And Marcus, focused on keeping his children fed and warm, had no idea the most powerful woman in the city had already decided one thing. He did not belong anywhere near her daughter. And if belonging required money, she would use money to erase him. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the threat. It was the silence. Marcus noticed it on a Tuesday morning when the harbor felt unusually polite. Men who usually shouted greetings nodded instead. Conversations lowered when he passed. A foreman who owed him money suddenly remembered an appointment and walked away mid-sentence. Even the gulls seemed quieter, circling without crying. He felt it in his chest long before his mind caught up. That afternoon, a white luxury sedan rolled onto the docks where it had no business being. It moved slowly, deliberately, tires crunching gravel like it was measuring every step. Marcus wiped his hands on a rag and instinctively glanced toward his boys. Malik, Micah, and Miles were stacked together on an old blanket, laughing at something only they understood. The car stopped. A man in a tailored gray suit stepped out first, then another. Both scanned the area the way security does when they believe the world should make room for them. Finally, the back door opened. Margaret Harrington emerged like the dock belonged to her. She wore cream-colored linen, untouched by wind or salt. Pearls sat perfectly at her throat. Her eyes moved once over the harbor, dismissing it before landing on Marcus with clinical interest. She did not smile. Marcus stood straight, not in defiance, in instinct. "Mr. Reed," she said, pronouncing his name carefully like she'd practiced. "We need to talk." He glanced at his sons. "You can say it here." Margaret's eyes flicked to the children. Something like irritation passed through her face. "This is not appropriate." "Then it's not happening," Marcus replied evenly. The dock went still. Margaret paused, then nodded to one of the men. 5 minutes. They stepped aside, but not far enough to be respectful. Marcus lifted Micah onto his hip. The boy rested his head against Marcus's shoulder, unbothered. That calm irritated her more than anger would have. "You've been spending time with my daughter," Margaret said. Marcus didn't deny it. "She comes to the docks." "She doesn't come for you." "She stays anyway." Margaret exhaled through her nose. "Let's not pretend this is something it is." Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his jaw, the one he'd learned to control years ago. "I'm not pretending anything." She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope, thick, heavy. She held it between two fingers like it might stain her. "There's $100,000 in here," she said. "Cashier's check cleared." The words hit the dock like a dropped anchor. Marcus stared at the envelope, then at her. "For what?" Margaret met his eyes, unflinching. "You will leave this city." The world seemed to narrow, sound dulling at the edges. Marcus shifted his weight, grounding himself. "You will relocate," she continued. "Today, tomorrow at the latest, you will not contact my daughter, you will not return, you will not speak about this conversation to anyone." Micah stirred, sensing the change in his father's body. Marcus laughed once, short, disbelieving. "You think you can buy people?" "I know I can," Margaret replied calmly. "Especially people with responsibilities." Her gaze dropped to the children. Something dangerous flickered behind Marcus's eyes. I'm not for sale, he said. Margaret tilted her head. Everyone is. He shook his head. You're wrong. She sighed as if disappointed. I didn't want this to be difficult. She nodded again. One of the men stepped forward, holding a tablet. He tapped the screen, then turned it so Marcus could see. Photos, his apartment, his building, the daycare he used twice a week when he could afford it, notes, schedules. A chill crept up Marcus's spine. You're behind on rent, Margaret said softly. Your lease is informal, your employer pays you under the table, and you're a single father with no extended family in the state. She let that settle. Child Services takes a special interest in situations like yours, she added. Unsafe environments, unstable income, no mother. Marcus's breath came slow, measured. You'd take my kids, he said quietly. Margaret didn't answer directly. I would hate for misunderstandings to happen. The dock seemed to tilt. For the first time, Marcus felt fear that had nothing to do with himself. He looked down at Malik, who had toddled over and grabbed his leg. Looked at Miles, chewing on a rope like it was treasure. 3 lives entirely dependent on his ability to make the right choice. Margaret watched him calculate. She had done this before. Different faces, same outcome. You have 24 hours, she said. Take the money and disappear or stay and fight a system you will not win. Marcus closed his eyes for half a second. When he opened them, something had changed. Where I go, he asked, you leave us alone. Margaret smiled faintly. As long as you keep your distance. He nodded once. Get the envelope away from my kids. She handed it to him. The weight of it felt heavier than it should have. That night Marcus packed in silence. He moved through the apartment like a ghost, folding clothes, sorting tools, leaving behind anything that felt rooted. The boys sensed something wrong. They clung to him, cried more than usual. Marcus held them until his arms ached. He wrote a letter to Evelyn and tore it up. He wrote another and burned it. By dawn, everything he owned fit into his truck. As he strapped the car seats in, Marcus looked back at the building one last time. Not with regret, with resolve. Because if the world wanted him gone, it had no idea what it had just set in motion. Marcus didn't drive far that first day. Not because he lacked direction, but because grief has weight, and weight slows movement. He parked at a rest stop just beyond the city limits, where the lights buzzed and the air smelled like oil and stale coffee. The boys slept in their car seats, heads tilted at impossible angles, trusting him the way only children can. Marcus sat in the driver's seat long after the engine cooled, hands resting on the wheel, replaying the moment Margaret Harrington's eyes had dropped to his children like leverage. He didn't cry. He couldn't afford that luxury. Instead, he planned. By morning, he was on the road again, heading south toward a coastal town so small it barely registered on maps. He rented a one-room unit behind a closed-down bait shop, paid 3 months up front, and started looking for work before the boxes were even unpacked. He fixed engines for cash, repaired hulls for favors, slept 4 hours a night, learned the layout of the new harbor the way a soldier learns terrain. But the money Margaret gave him stayed untouched. Not because he was proud, because he was cautious. Marcus had learned a long time ago that money given with conditions never really belonged to you. It waited, watched, expected repayment in ways you couldn't predict. Weeks passed, then months. Evelyn Harrington spiraled in his absence. She searched the docks, called numbers that went dead, asked questions no one wanted to answer. When she confronted her mother, Margaret didn't raise her voice or show anger. She simply offered a version of events polished enough to sound reasonable. He chose money over stability, Margaret said. I protected you. Evelyn wanted to believe her. But something felt wrong. Then one night, Evelyn found the transfer. Buried in shell companies and layered accounts, she saw it. A 6-figure withdrawal tied to an NDA and a relocation clause. No charity, no business acquisition, just hush money dressed up as discretion. Her hands shook as she realized what her mother had done. Meanwhile, Marcus received a call that would quietly alter everything. It came from Captain Louis Ortega, an old Navy contact who remembered Marcus not as a struggling dock mechanic, but as one of the sharpest marine engineers he'd ever worked with. Louis had followed Marcus's career from a distance. always wondering why a man with that mind disappeared from serious work. "I heard you're back near water," Lewis said, "and I heard you're hungry." The project wasn't glamorous at first. It involved testing propulsion systems for private vessels operating beyond standard shipping lanes. Complex, risky, quiet, exactly the kind of work Marcus understood. He brought his sons with him, set them up in a small office corner with toys and books, and worked while they slept. Marcus didn't just fix problems. He redesigned solutions. Within months, the project expanded. Investors appeared. Contracts multiplied. Marcus negotiated equity instead of salary, ownership instead of permission. Every decision he made carried one image in his mind: 3 boys who would never be cornered the way he had been. When the first prototype exceeded expectations, the room went silent. When the second shattered efficiency records, silence turned into respect. And when Marcus was offered partial ownership in a luxury vessel designed to showcase the system's power, he didn't hesitate. He named the yacht Naomi. The day it launched, Marcus stood on deck with his sons beside him, the water stretching endless and blue ahead. He didn't smile for the cameras, he smiled for them. Back in the city, Margaret Harrington felt something shift long before she knew why. Old allies stopped returning calls. Board members asked uncomfortable questions. A rumor circulated about a black-owned vessel outperforming Harrington shipping routes at a fraction of the cost. Margaret dismissed it at first. Then she didn't. The name surfaced at a private marina event. Marcus Reed. Her blood ran cold. Because in all her calculations, all her power plays, she had assumed one thing without question: that once removed, he would stay gone. She had paid to erase him. She never imagined she was funding his return. And far out at sea, Marcus watched his triplets race across the deck of a yacht the world said was never meant to be his. He lifted them one by one, holding them against the wind, and whispered a promise he had finally learned how to keep. "Whatever they try to take from you," he said softly, "we build something bigger." The confrontation that was meant to end him had only given him distance. And distance, Marcus Reed had learned, was exactly what vision needed to grow. Success did not arrive with celebration. It arrived quietly. The way tides change direction long before anyone notices the water moving. Marcus Reed learned that lesson early. The yacht Naomi was no longer just a vessel. It was proof. Proof that his mind still worked the way it always had. Proof that no amount of humiliation could erase skill, discipline, or vision. But Marcus did not allow himself to enjoy it too loudly. Joy, he had learned, could attract attention, and attention in the wrong hands could become another form of danger. He kept the boys grounded. No excess. No indulgence that might confuse security with worth. Malik, Micah, and Miles still helped wipe down decks with rags too big for their hands. They still ate simple meals together at the small table below deck. Marcus made sure they understood something before they could even properly speak it. We are not better than anyone, but we are never less. Yet distance had its own cost. At night, when the yacht was still and the boys slept curled into each other like they had since birth, Marcus found himself thinking about Evelyn. Not romantically at first, emotionally. Wondering how someone raised in power processed betrayal. Wondering if she ever questioned the silence he'd been forced into. He never reached out. Silence, once imposed, became a boundary he refused to break without purpose. Back in the city, Evelyn Harrington felt that silence like pressure in her chest. Her mother moved on as if nothing had happened. Charity galas, strategy meetings, controlled laughter, but Evelyn noticed the cracks. Margaret snapped more often. Her patience shortened. She asked too many questions about maritime competitors that didn't exist 6 months ago. Evelyn dug deeper. She found records of NDAs tied to Marcus's name. Legal language so aggressive it read less like a contract and more like a warning. She found internal emails discussing risk mitigation and undesirable proximity. And finally, she found the document that made her hands go cold. A contingency memo outlining steps to escalate pressure if Marcus refused to leave voluntarily. Evelyn closed the file and realized something fundamental. Her mother hadn't protected her. She had erased a man. The weight of that knowledge changed how Evelyn saw the world. The docks she once visited casually now felt like a crime scene she'd walked away from without noticing the blood. She returned there alone one evening, standing where Marcus used to work, staring at oil-stained concrete like it might answer her. People remembered him. They spoke carefully, as if his name might still be monitored. "He loved those kids," one deckhand said quietly. "He never begged," another added. "He just vanished." Evelyn felt complicit in a crime she never approved. Meanwhile, Marcus's presence in elite maritime circles grew impossible to ignore. Captain Luis Ortega watched it happen with a mix of pride and caution. He warned Marcus more than once. "Power doesn't forgive surprises," Luis said, "especially when it comes from the wrong place." Marcus understood. He attended meetings but rarely spoke more than necessary. Let others underestimate him. Let them assume he was lucky. Assumptions were useful shields. But one assumption followed him everywhere: that the yacht was a fluke. Then came the Harrington contract bid. Marcus didn't know it at first. He only knew that his propulsion system had outperformed every competitor in a blind efficiency test commissioned by a multinational shipping consortium. When the results were unsealed, gasps filled the room. The Harrington name sat second on the list. For the first time in decades, Harrington Shipping had been beaten. Margaret Harrington read the report twice, then a third time. She stared at the numbers at the vessel identification code tied to the winning system. Her legal team waited nervously. No one spoke. Finally, she said the name. "Marcus Reed." The room froze. Margaret stood slowly. She had spent her life believing control was permanent, that once something was removed, it stayed removed. But this was resurgence, and resurgence, she knew, required response. She ordered an investigation. Not a public one, a personal one. She wanted to know how a man she had paid to disappear had returned with leverage. She wanted to know who helped him, and most importantly, she wanted to know how close he was to her daughter again. Unaware of the approaching storm, Marcus focused on his children. The boys were growing fast, asking questions, curious about everything. Marcus told them stories at night, not fairy tales, but real ones. Stories about oceans that didn't forgive arrogance, about ships that sank because men ignored warnings, about how strength wasn't loud, it was steady. One evening, as the yacht docked at a quiet marina, Marcus noticed a familiar figure at the edge of the pier. Evelyn Harrington. She stood alone, hands clasped, eyes searching the deck like she wasn't sure she deserved to be there. Marcus's chest tightened, not with anger but with something unresolved. He didn't wave. He waited. Evelyn stepped forward slowly, every footstep heavy with words she hadn't rehearsed. "Marcus," she said. He nodded. "Evelyn." Silence stretched between them, thick, charged, honest. "I didn't know," she said finally. "Not then." He believed her. That surprised him. "I know," he replied. She swallowed. "My mother." "I don't want to talk about her," Marcus said gently but firmly. Evelyn nodded, respecting the boundary. Her eyes flicked toward the boys playing behind him. "They're beautiful." "They're my why," he said. She hesitated. She's asking questions again. Marcus's expression didn't change, but something hardened behind his calm. "Tell her nothing," he said. "I can't promise that," Evelyn admitted, "but I won't be silent again." That mattered more than apology. As Evelyn walked away, Marcus watched the horizon darken. He felt it then, the pressure returning, not fear, awareness. Margaret Harrington was circling. And this time, Marcus Reed wasn't running. He was ready. Margaret Harrington did not confront threats head-on. She studied them, measured them, decided where pressure would hurt most. After learning Marcus Reed had not only returned but quietly surpassed Harrington shipping and performance metrics, she did not rage. She did not panic. She retreated into strategy, the way generals did before wars they were certain they could still win. Her first move was subtle. A compliance audit was requested on the marina where Marcus docked the Naomi. Not officially from Harrington Shipping, of course. It came through a third-party environmental firm with deep ties to Harrington-funded foundations. Inspectors arrived with clipboards and tight smiles, measuring emissions, checking paperwork, asking questions that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with intimidation. Marcus watched from the deck as Captain Luis Ortega dealt with them calmly. "They're fishing," Luis said later. They won't find anything, but they want you visible. Marcus nodded. Let them look. Visibility had once been dangerous. Now it was leverage. But pressure didn't come from one direction. Evelyn Harrington returned to her mother's estate that night with her mind already made up. She'd spent weeks wrestling with guilt, anger, and disbelief. But seeing Marcus again, seeing what he'd built without bitterness, had stripped her of excuses. At dinner, Margaret spoke casually about shipping lanes and market volatility. She mentioned the efficiency tests as if they were curiosities, not warnings. Competition keeps us sharp, she said, cutting her food precisely, even when it comes from unexpected places. Evelyn set her fork down. You paid him to leave, she said. The room went still. Margaret did not look up. I protected you. You threatened his children, Evelyn replied, her voice steady but low. Margaret finally raised her eyes. There was no shame there, only certainty. I did what was necessary. For who? Evelyn asked. For the family, Margaret said. For the name. Evelyn leaned back, studying the woman who had raised her to believe morality was flexible if the outcome was clean enough. You didn't erase him, she said quietly. You sharpened him. Margaret smiled thinly. Then he should thank me. That was the moment Evelyn understood there would be no apology, no reflection, no line her mother wouldn't cross if it meant maintaining control. Meanwhile, Marcus received an invitation that forced him to confront a different kind of power. The International Maritime Innovation Summit. Invitation only, closed press, the kind of room where decisions reshaped industries quietly. Marcus had avoided such spaces before, not out of fear, but because entry often came with conditions. This one didn't. He brought the boys with him. Not into the meetings, but into the building. He wanted them to see spaces they'd been told weren't meant for them, to normalize presence where others expected absence. Inside the summit, Marcus listened more than he spoke. He let others debate regulations and profit margins. When asked directly about his propulsion system, he explained it simply. No arrogance, no apology, just facts. Respect shifted. One executive pulled him aside. You're disruptive, the man said, not in a bad way. Marcus smiled politely. I just fix what's inefficient. That night offers came, partnerships, expansion opportunities, global routes. Marcus declined most of them. Power multiplied fastest when chosen carefully. Margaret's investigation intensified. She learned about Captain Ortega, about the Navy contracts, about the equity deals that turned Marcus from operator to owner. Each discovery tightened something in her chest, not fear but resentment, because none of it fit her narrative. She had believed Marcus was desperate. Desperate men folded. Marcus had not. Her next move was personal. She reached out to the one institution Marcus trusted above all else. The law. A report was filed anonymously questioning the legality of Marcus's initial relocation, suggesting coercion, implying financial misconduct tied to the original $100,000 payment. The irony did not escape her. If Marcus fought back, he would expose the transaction, and with it her involvement. If he stayed silent, suspicion would follow him. Marcus was informed within hours. Lewis brought him the news quietly. They're circling with paperwork now. Marcus didn't react immediately. He watched his sons chase each other across the deck, their laughter cutting clean through tension. She's forcing me into the open, Marcus said finally. Lewis nodded. You ready for that? Marcus thought of the rest stop. The envelope. The night he packed his life into a truck, he thought of how silence had protected him then and how it might destroy him now. Yes, he said, but not alone. He made one call. Evelyn answered on the second ring. She's coming for you legally, she said before he could speak. I saw the filings. I know, Marcus replied. I need you to do something. Anything. Tell the truth, he said, publicly. There was a pause, not fear, calculation. That will burn bridges, Evelyn said. Some bridges deserve to burn, Marcus replied. The hearing was scheduled quickly. Not a trial, a review, closed door but with enough influential observers to ensure word would leak. Margaret arrived confident, dressed in authority. Marcus arrived with Lewis and a slim folder. Evelyn arrived last. When asked to speak, she stood. And she told them everything. The payment, the threats, the contingency plan, the leverage used against a black single father because he was deemed inconvenient. The room shifted. Margaret did not interrupt. She watched her daughter dismantle her strategy with facts, with documents, with calm resolve. When it was Marcus's turn, he did not accuse. He explained. "I took the money because my children were threatened," he said evenly. "I left because the system was already leaning against me. I built what I built because distance gave me clarity." He slid the envelope across the table, unopened. "I never used it." Silence followed. Not victory, not yet, but something had cracked. Outside, cameras waited. Margaret Harrington stepped into the light, expression controlled but eyes burning. Marcus stepped beside her, not behind. The world was watching now. And distance, the very thing meant to erase him, had carried Marcus Reed far enough to return with truth, leverage, and no intention of disappearing again. The rising action was no longer quiet. It was irreversible. The cameras were never supposed to be there. The review hearing had been scheduled as a quiet proceeding, closed doors, controlled language, influence exchanged behind polished tables. That was how people like Margaret Harrington preferred conflict. Quiet, sanitized, invisible to anyone without power. But truth has a way of leaking. By the time Marcus Reed stepped out of the building, the plaza across the street was already crowded. Journalists, industry analysts, dock workers who had recognized his name when rumors started circulating, even a few parents pushing strollers, drawn by instinct more than information. Marcus stopped when he saw them. He hadn't prepared a speech. He hadn't planned a reveal. He had only promised himself one thing: no more silence. Margaret Harrington exited moments later, flanked by attorneys and advisors, her posture immaculate, her expression composed into something that suggested inconvenience rather than threat. She did not look at Marcus. Not yet. Evelyn followed them both. She stood between two worlds now, no longer shielded by privilege, not yet fully free of it. Her face was pale, but her shoulders were straight. The decision she had made inside that room had already rewritten her life. She knew it, accepted it. A reporter shouted Marcus's name. He turned. "Mr. Reed," the woman called, "did Harrington Shipping pay you to leave the city?" Margaret's head snapped toward him. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. Marcus could have deflected. He could have deferred to lawyers. He could have let the story spin itself into something manageable. Instead, he answered, "Yes." The crowd shifted. "And did they threaten your children?" another voice asked. Marcus felt his chest tighten, but not with fear, with clarity. "Yes." A murmur rippled outward, growing louder as more people leaned in. Margaret stepped forward sharply. "This is highly inappropriate," she said. "Any statements made here are incomplete and irresponsible." Marcus turned to face her then. "You paid for my silence," he said calmly. "You don't get to control my truth." The words landed harder than shouting ever could. A reporter turned to Evelyn. "Ms. Harrington, is this true?" Evelyn didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, "and I helped expose it." That was the moment the ground shifted. Margaret stared at her daughter, disbelief flashing into something darker. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said tightly. "I do," Evelyn replied. "I finally do." The plaza erupted with questions, cameras flashing, voices overlapping. Marcus stepped back slightly as Captain Luis Ortega positioned himself beside him, not protectively but supportively. The boys were not there. Marcus had made sure of that. Some moments didn't belong to children. Inside the building, the fallout began immediately. Board members demanded emergency sessions. Legal teams scrambled. Harrington Shipping's largest partners requested explanations they were not prepared to give. The story spread fast, not because it was scandalous, but because it was familiar. A powerful institution. A black man removed quietly. Money used as leverage. Children used as pressure. People recognized the pattern. Margaret retreated that night into the one place she had always believed was impenetrable, her office. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city she had shaped from behind glass. She stared at it now, not with pride but calculation. Damage could still be contained. She had resources, allies, decades of influence. What she had not planned for was moral exposure. The next morning, the consortium that had commissioned the efficiency tests released a public statement. The propulsion system developed by Marcus Reed's firm was not only superior, it was now under consideration for long-term contracts across multiple international routes. Harrington shipping was excluded pending investigation. The stock dipped. Margaret felt it like a physical blow. She called Marcus. He didn't answer. She left a message, measured, legal, devoid of apology. She spoke of misunderstandings, of mutual benefit, of discretion. Marcus listened to it later, standing on the deck of the Naomi, the sea calm beneath him. He deleted it. That afternoon, Evelyn arrived at the marina alone. No press, no entourage, just her. Marcus saw her approach from the bridge and came down to meet her. For a moment, neither spoke. Too much had happened, too much still hung between them. "I didn't do it for you," Evelyn said finally. "I did it because it was wrong." "I know," Marcus replied. She exhaled, relieved. She's losing ground fast, not everything, but enough. Marcus nodded. Power doesn't disappear overnight. No, Evelyn agreed, but it fractures. They walked the length of the dock together, not touching, not distant either. When they stopped near the bow, Evelyn looked out at the water. "She taught me that control was the same thing as care," she said quietly. "I don't believe that anymore." Marcus watched his sons through the window, playing with a toy boat, laughing. "Care doesn't threaten," he said. "It protects." Evelyn nodded. The final confrontation came sooner than Marcus expected. Margaret arrived at the marina just before sunset. This time she came alone. No security, no lawyers, just herself. Marcus waited. She walked toward him with measured steps, stopping a few feet away. The water reflected light onto her face, softening lines that stress had sharpened. "You could have taken the money and stayed quiet," she said. "You'd be rich now." Marcus met her gaze. "I am rich." She scoffed. "This will cost you." "It already did," he replied. "I paid, you just didn't notice." Margaret studied him, searching for weakness, for anger, for triumph. She found neither. "You think this makes you better than me?" she asked. "No," Marcus said. "It makes me free." For the first time, Margaret faltered. "Do you know what it took to build what I built?" she demanded. "What I sacrificed?" Marcus's voice remained steady. "Do you know what it takes to raise 3 children alone after burying their mother?" Silence stretched between them. Margaret looked past him to the yacht, to the boys' laughter echoing faintly through the open hatch. Something unreadable crossed her face. "You could have stayed gone," she said. Marcus stepped closer, not threatening, just present. "You tried to erase me," he said quietly, "but you only gave me distance." He turned away then, ending the conversation without ceremony. Margaret stood there alone, the city she once commanded no longer bending automatically to her will. The climax didn't end with handcuffs or shouting. It ended with exposure, with truth standing in daylight unafraid, with a man once paid to disappear choosing, finally, to be seen. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting gold across the water, Marcus Reed stood on the deck of his ship, his children at his side, knowing that whatever came next, it would be faced on his terms. Because power had shifted, and it would never return to its old shape again. The days that followed did not explode. They unfolded. That was the part most people didn't understand. They expected collapse to be loud, sirens, arrests, public humiliation. But real consequences, Marcus learned, often arrived quietly, like tides receding to reveal what had always been buried. Harrington shipping did not crumble overnight. It was too big for that, too embedded, but something fundamental shifted. Contracts stalled, partners hesitated, long-standing allies asked for temporary distance. The name still carried weight, but it no longer moved unchecked. Margaret Harrington felt that loss most in the small moments. A call not returned. A meeting postponed indefinitely. A polite smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. For the first time in her life, control required effort. Inside her office, Margaret reviewed reports late into the night, searching for leverage that no longer existed. The legal exposure was contained, but the moral stain spread faster than any lawsuit. She had spent decades believing that outcomes justified methods. Now the world was asking whether her outcomes had ever been worth the cost. She never admitted regret, but she felt consequence. Evelyn Harrington moved out of the estate within a week. Not dramatically, no screaming confrontation. She packed what mattered and left behind what didn't. The house that once felt like destiny now felt like a museum, beautiful, curated, lifeless. She rented a small apartment overlooking the water. Not the docks where Marcus worked, but close enough to hear boats at night. It helped her sleep. She resigned from 2 boards her mother had placed her on, publicly cited ethical misalignment. Privately, she knew it was the first decision she'd made without seeking permission. People whispered. Some praised her courage. Some called it rebellion. Some called it betrayal. Evelyn accepted all of it. Marcus Reed returned to routine, not because nothing had changed, but because everything had. The Naomi became more than a yacht. It became a symbol whether Marcus wanted it to or not. Invitations poured in, speaking requests, profiles. He declined most. He learned early that visibility could become another cage if you weren't careful. Instead, he focused on structure. He formalized his company, brought in engineers from overlooked backgrounds, created paid apprenticeships at the docks, specifically for single parents and veterans who'd been quietly pushed out of opportunity. He didn't advertise it as charity. He called it investment. When asked why, Marcus answered simply, "Talent doesn't disappear, it gets ignored." The boys adjusted faster than anyone. Children often do. Malik learned to read early. Micah became obsessed with knots and ropes. Miles asked endless questions about engines, water, and why the moon followed the boat at night. Marcus answered all of them patiently, aware that he was shaping more than futures. He was shaping how they understood power. He never told them about the money. He never told them about the threat. Not yet. Some stories, he believed, should wait until children had enough language to understand dignity without fear. One afternoon, months later, Marcus received a letter. Handwritten, carefully folded. From Margaret Harrington. He didn't open it immediately. He let it sit on the table while he cooked dinner, listening to the boys argue over who got the last piece of bread. When the kitchen quieted and the sun dipped low, he finally unfolded it. The letter did not contain an apology. It contained acknowledgement. Margaret wrote about her upbringing, about scarcity disguised as privilege, about learning early that control was safety. She did not excuse her actions, but she did not soften them either. She admitted that she had underestimated him, that she had believed systems always favored people like her. "I was wrong," the letter read. "Not about the system, but about you." Marcus read it twice. Then he folded it back up and placed it in a drawer. Not forgiveness, but closure. Evelyn and Marcus did not rush toward anything that resembled romance. They rebuilt something quieter first. Trust. They met occasionally, sometimes at the marina, sometimes over coffee where no one recognized them. They talked about books, about childhood, about how identity could feel like both inheritance and prison. Evelyn met the boys properly one evening, bringing nothing but herself. She knelt to their level, listened to their stories, laughed when they corrected her. Marcus watched closely, not suspiciously, but attentively. She treated them like people. That mattered. The media eventually moved on. Another scandal, another outrage, another story. But something lingered. Dock workers spoke Marcus's name with pride. Single fathers asked him for advice. Young engineers sent messages thanking him for making space where none had existed before. Marcus answered when he could. Not as a savior, as someone who understood. 1 year later, a new marina opened under cooperative ownership, designed for independent operators priced out of traditional spaces. Marcus attended the opening quietly, standing in the back while others spoke. When invited to say a few words, he kept it brief. "I was once paid to leave this city," he said. "Instead, I learned how to return without asking permission." Applause followed, not thunderous but deep. Margaret Harrington did not attend. But she heard. In her office, now smaller and more restrained than before, she watched the coverage in silence. Power still surrounded her, but it no longer insulated her from consequence. She had lost her daughter's admiration, lost unquestioned authority, lost the illusion that money could erase what it touched. That loss stayed with her. As for Marcus, the greatest resolution came one quiet night at sea. The Naomi drifted gently under a sky full of stars. The boys slept below deck, their breathing steady. Marcus stood at the rail alone, letting the wind move through him. He thought about the envelope. The rest stop. The threat. He realized something then, not with anger but with clarity. What Margaret Harrington had tried to take from him was not his place. It was his voice. And by choosing distance over destruction, Marcus had found it. He looked out over the water, endless, unowned, indifferent to hierarchy. And for the first time since Naomi's death, since the night his life had shattered into responsibility and grief, Marcus Reed felt something settle fully into place. Not victory. Peace. The kind that comes when no one else gets to decide whether you belong. The kind that remains. This story was never really about a yacht. Or money. Or even power. It was about who gets erased quietly, and who gets to decide they won't stay erased. Marcus Reed was offered a deal the world offers too often. Take the money, accept the humiliation, disappear so others can stay comfortable. And for a moment, he did what any parent protecting their children would do. He chose survival. But survival was never his ending. What changed everything wasn't revenge or rage. It was distance. Distance gave Marcus clarity. It gave him room to rebuild without permission, without apology, without shrinking himself to fit someone else's idea of where he belonged. And in that space, dignity grew louder than fear. Margaret Harrington believed money could erase consequences, that systems would always bend toward those who already held power. What she failed to understand is that systems crack when truth stands in the open, and that the people they try hardest to silence often return with the clearest voices. Evelyn's transformation reminds us of something just as important. Privilege doesn't become justice by staying silent. It becomes justice when it chooses truth over comfort, even when that truth costs something. This story teaches us that kindness without courage changes nothing, and courage without integrity becomes just another form of control. Real power doesn't threaten children. It doesn't buy silence. It doesn't need to erase others to exist. Real power builds. Real power protects. Real power makes room. And maybe the most important lesson of all is this. You can pay someone to leave a place. You can pressure them into silence. You can even convince yourself they were never meant to be there. But you can't stop a person who knows their worth from returning. Not louder, not angrier, but stronger, freer, and impossible to ignore. If this story moved you, share it with someone who's been told, directly or quietly, that they don't belong. Sometimes the greatest comeback isn't proving people wrong. It's refusing to disappear.